Welcome, workers and friends. Welcome back to Working Class Revolt. I'm your host, Dust James, the Marxist Leninist truck driver, come to you live from my humble home in rural North Carolina. And as always, I'm joined by my very great friend and comrade from down under, union organizer, Brother David Fox. How's it going?
Very good, thank you.
Right on, brother, right on. So we are very, very honored to have with us the ideological powerhouse behind the very successful and positive organization of Midwestern Marx, avid scholar, writer, fellow streamer, brother Carlos Garrido. How you doing?
I'm doing good, brother. Thank you, guys, for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Right on. So we're going to get right into it. And we start with labor updates. And the reason why we start with labor updates is this is a tradition of the American Communist Movement, where we understand that if we truly want to inform ourselves, we need to rely on our own connections and institutions and collectives. And we need to get the material understanding of the conditions from the people themselves. So a lot of principled communist parties would give questionnaires or have meetings where they talk about the conditions they face. So I'm going to start here. Gas prices have doubled in the last year. Real inflation for working families total is in the double digits. People are seeing people have taken a pay cut, and that's the reality of the situation. I don't want to go too far into it. We did a more in-depth discussion on this a few weeks ago on our episode of Commie Son of the South. If folks want to go check that out, brother Fox, just a very quick labor update on conditions in Australia.
Yeah, look, they're not so dissimilar to what you just talked about then. Inflation was going to head by was going to rise by 6% by December this year. It's now looking at 7%. Same thing. A lot of working people are finding it very hard to get by. Obviously, price of groceries and utilities have gone through the roof. Gas is the same. Gas and petrol and diesel, they've all gone right through the roof as well. The fuel excise, there was 20 cents taken off the fuel excise on the previous government, but that will be back in place by September. So an extra 20, we use the metric system, so 20 cents a litre extra. A lot of people are going to be finding it hard to get by. Because all that cost of fuel, especially, flows on back to the worker again and buying basic consumables.
Let's see, brother Carlos, just give us a quick update on the conditions that you're facing or within your community.
Well, as a graduate assistant instructor, we get paid 9 months out of the year, and I'm approaching the months where I don't get a paycheck, but I still got to pay rent. And when I go to the gas tank, and a car that would take $22 to fill up is taking 61 bucks. It's pretty hard. These are the months where I have to get the magician cape out, get the magic hat where bunnies come out of, and try to figure out how the hell I'm gonna pay for rent, for food, and for the basic necessities of life. So although in terms of my position in relation to the means of production, I don't technically consider myself within the working class in terms of community. I certainly feel the same struggles the vast majority of Americans workers feel today.
Thank you, brother. So we're going to continue and get right into our news update portion. And we haven't had a show in about a month. Last time we were on here, we had a young woman from the United Kingdom, from the Workers' Party, and folks can go back and check that out as well. But there's been a lot of news in this current section. A lot has happened, and I'm going to bring in, something that's near and dear to my heart and my community, and that's the subject of immigration. And we saw this flare up recently. I'm gonna bring up an article from my phone here. Give me 1 second. Yes. So in San Antonio, 50 plus people were found dead in the back of a tractor trailer. More than 50 undocumented migrants were found, among them 27 from Mexico, 14 from Honduras, 7 from Guatemala, and 2 from El Salvador. An abandoned truck on the outskirts of the city of San Antonio, Texas. And I'm looking at through all of these bourgeois articles. And a lot of these bourgeois articles, just the very language that it speaks from is completely devoid of humanity, completely devoid of the international understanding of imperialism. It speaks about immigration as if it's something to do with the law or a legal status, the way they dehumanize people and they simply refer to them as, there's a wonderful country music song, which actually is a cover of the great Woody Guthrie. That's a great cover of it from Johnny Cash and Johnny Rodriguez, of Woody Guthrie's song "Deportee," and you can kind of see how the newspaper kind of dehumanizes and puts human beings into a statistic. Talks about like this is a legal problem. This is and criminalizes people, and it's absolutely disgusting. And I think this opportunity, this tragedy, we're going to have to speak on it. We're going to have to speak on it, from our perspective. And the reality is that Mexico, Latin America are oppressed nations. People are fleeing. Did I read on there? Did I say anything about folks fleeing Nicaragua? Did I see anything about folks fleeing Cuba? Nah, they're fleeing the capitalist countries that the monopoly capitalists here control, that the monopoly capitalists exploit. And a lot of these communities are indigenous communities. A higher portion of the people that have died on the border have been people don't even speak Spanish, people that speak indigenous languages. And this is the global economic system. It's not a flaw in the immigration law or whatever. People are fleeing the exploitation of the same monopoly corporations that are holding down workers here. And, it's got to be said, and these are human beings with potential and dreams and lives, and they're being forced out of their homelands. The places they love ain't coming to America. This is the best country in the world or what have you, and all that bullshit. They want to stay where they're at and have wonderful, fulfilling lives, and they're forced in these horrible situations. And these drug cartels and coyote and human smuggling organizations they're only a symptom. They're not the problem. They are a symptom of the problem, which is monopoly capitalism, which is in this entire system. And this is, honestly, if you look at the portion of indigenous people that are kept in, horrible conditions throughout Latin America, die along the border, are kept in the worst positions here. This is a continuation of the national oppression of indigenous people and the genocide of indigenous people. And we have to see it that way. And we got to look at this from a material basis. And these are fellow workers. These are fellow human beings. And this is a class issue. This ain't, some kind of social issue. This is super exploitation of fellow workers that is dragging everybody's wages down here. And, it needs to be talked about every now and then, because the corporate news, they talk about it in the wrong way, or they don't talk about it at all. So I think that's going to do it for my spill. Brother Carlos Garrido, maybe you can talk a little bit on this issue.
Well, I think you hit the nail in the head, man. People don't leave their country because of Mickey Mouse and Hollywood and all these other things. People don't leave their country because they hate their country. They leave their country because their country has been ravished by imperialism. Their people are offered the only alternative in order to survive is to be super exploited, so that the imperialists can get the super profits that are then filtered here that end up sustaining some form of a labor aristocracy. So that's the reality no one wants to leave their country. I have my father has an analogy that he usually uses. He's been telling me this since I was little, but every time they ask him why'd you leave Cuba, one of the things that he says is for the same reason why if you take a beehive's source of food, the bees are going to follow. You know, they're following the wealth that you have extracted from them, and they're going to where the wealth is going. And the reality is sad, but you fight it not by addressing the symptom, although addressing the symptom could provide, band-aid solutions which might improve people's lives on the short term. But ultimately, what you have to do is fight the capitalist imperialist system, which we all live under. And as you rightfully said, it's the same system that keeps half of Americans a lost paycheck away from homelessness. So it's in all of our interests, marginalizing oppressed communities and the working class of the U.S., of the belly of the beast, to fight against this order.
Thank you, Brother Carlos. Comrade David Fox, anything to add on this section?
Well, because I'm over here in Australia, I'm just up to date with that particular issue. I've only heard bits of news items. I mean, it's terrible what's going on, and actually tragedy, the loss of 50 people and possibly even more, and people dying like that. I mean, obviously, it shows you overall though. It's like you're spot on the point there, Dust. Yeah, the fact is, it's a system itself. It's not about how some mishandling somewhere or some decision. It's the actual system itself that's creating all this. And I love that little terminology used, Carlos. You take the honey from the bees will follow. It's certainly, and that's what's happened. Basically, imperialism's ripped the wealth out of all these countries, left them with nothing. So, what do the powers that be expect them to do? Sit there and starve? So they need to live, and basically that's what they're doing. They're trying to provide for their basic needs for human survival: clothing, food, shelter, water, and obviously utilities to get by. And that's so this is clear shows that this system is really needs to go really completely, and our brand new world.
Thank you, brother Fox. I think there's something to say about selective or the emphasis that the imperialist media does. When there's a school shooting, we hear about it. When there's a war in Europe, and we hear about those victims, but there's constantly every year thousands of people dying in starvation in the global South, as well as dying along the border, trying to come to the United States, that has stolen the resources from those countries. Comrade Fox, I actually wanted to start with the good news, but I got on the bad news first. Come out here with that good news you got for us, brother.
Well, it's some interesting turn of events in Europe. Obviously, the farmers on strike or blockading the Netherlands at the moment. Well, it's expanded to other European countries, Germany and Poland. The farmers are coming out in support there as well because they've been told basically there's no more. I think it's nitrogen they need to use for growing the crops. And they've obviously got overhead costs. They can't make ends meet. Basically, all the excuse was, oh, we'll blame Russia, which had nothing to do with it at all. But all this whole imperialist policy put onto them, it's just basically they've just had enough, and that was it. So, and I think it's good to see that solidarity. I think we need to watch that as events unfold even further there in Europe. I hope it might inspire too other farmers elsewhere around the world to start fighting back against austerity and other measures that basically stop what they do for a living, basically grow food for us and produce food for us. So that's that, and I think that actually warrants our support. And I think that's it would be actually really good if it develops in a higher level Australia where working people unite with the farmers. And so we've had enough of all this. We've had enough of austerity. We've had enough of all the excuses why you can't provide anymore. And the system needs changing. So watch this space. I only just found out this morning. As I said, it's spreading throughout Europe. So there's some good news there.
Thank you, Comrade Fox. I think I have an interesting theory that I apply to the geopolitical situation. that I haven't heard a lot of other places. And honestly, my humble, truck driving self, because I got, my Marxist training directly from a collective of workers and the people and a militant tradition, I'm actually more prepared to analyze things than a lot of these academics up here trying to keep their position in their bourgeois academic institutions. And what I noticed is the United States is the imperial core. And what I mean by that, the monopoly capitalists, the monopolies, the five oil and banking cartels, 5 or 6 oil and banking cartels that run the entire global economy. Even socialist and anti-imperialist countries have to deal with the global economy that they're in. And because of that, because they had such dominance and power, I believe they were able to repress the workers' movement in the United States more so than the junior imperialist powers. If we look in the United States, we have no health care. If we look in the junior imperialist powers in Europe, UK is actually, I think, is closer tied in with the imperialist bloc. I think they're a little bit higher up on the ladder than Europe and Australia as well. And China, I mean, not China, but Japan is really a junior imperialist partner, maybe even further down in the hierarchy of all that. But if you noticed, the workers' movement here has been completely destroyed. Our communist parties were outlawed. The Panthers were shot down in cold blood. And we're really lacking a union movement here. And it was the union movement that fought for those kind of social democratic policies. So I think we can learn from our brothers and sisters in the junior imperialist countries, but understand that it's not the fault of the American worker. The American worker is not inherently fascist or inherently reactionary. The American worker was brutally suppressed by the strongest monopoly capitalist and the strongest media system that was ever out there. So when we hear about these, workers fighting back in Europe, we got to understand and not like start holding illusions in other sections of imperialist social democracy. Those governments are equally in with the imperialists. And we see it now with the Ukraine situation. What's going on now? The junior imperialists who have a stronger worker movement in Europe, they're being the first ones pushed under the bus with the disruption of the economy so the monopoly capitalists can go against the Russians. And it's absolutely wonderful to see the fight back from the European workers to fight against the austerity that's being pushed on them for the benefit of the monopoly capitalists to attack the Russian people. And when they attacked the Russian people, they attacked all oppressed nations. Because if you look at what Russia has done in selling low-priced food to Africa, selling fertilizer to Africa and the oppressed nations, and now we've got sanctions against Russia, and it's destabilized their economy, doesn't allow we have mass starvation in Africa. There's a direct line between the U.S. imperialist attack on Russia and the starvation in Africa. And a lot of people like to blame Russia. And they like to say, oh, Putin went too far with it. He got all bold-faced and he went over there too quickly and stuff. And he caused some of this economic turmoil. And the reality is that Putin didn't cause the economic turmoil. The Russian people were standing up for their basic security rights, and they've been pushed against, and they finally stood up for ethnic Russians that were being slaughtered on their border. And in reality, Putin and the Russian people are not creating the instability. It was the imperialists. And in reality, them standing up against the power of the monopoly capitalism is making a world where the monopoly capitalists will not be able to do this again. Let's see. I know I put a lot on the line out there because of that. Brother Carlos El Garrido, go ahead. Any response to these ideas?
I want to respond directly to what you just said about Russia. People have to realize, Marxists have to realize that the primary contradiction that we face today is monopoly capital. It's imperialism. And I think there's something to be said about who is supporting Russia. Who is supporting Russia? What side is supporting Russia? And that should always have at least it should be a factor in our analysis of the situation. When but a speech that I think I'm freezing, but there was a speech that Fidel gave in 1989, and he says, if these reforms are so progressive and revolutionary, why are the imperialists applauding, right? And I think that the same logic applies in a reverse form. If Russia is so bad, why is it that those who have been under the boot of imperialism for so long are the ones that are raising the Russian flag and allying with Russia? And that's something that we have to take into account. It's not just a simplistic analysis. It's a real analysis. Who's supporting who? And the oppressed people and the countries that have waged successful revolutions that are outside of the sphere of influence of monopoly capital, they're siding with Russia unanimously. The other thing that I wanted to mention, you brought up the farmers' protests. I haven't followed them too closely, but I do want to say this because this is one of the things that I've noticed is people on the left who haven't supported it because supposedly the class position of the farmers is petty bourgeois, and if it's petty bourgeois, then it's not revolutionary, it's not the proletariat, and therefore you should not support it. That's absolutely incorrect, right? It's incorrect. It's a tactic that has been used with other mobilizations in the U.S. And when it's been used in the U.S., it fails to realize that the reason why some of these segments of the working mass aren't being paid by wages and are self-contracted, it's directly an attack of capital on labor, because in doing so, the capitalist removes all sorts of responsibilities that he has towards his workers, which are responsibilities that the labor movement has fought for. If they consider them independent contractors, you don't have any responsibilities towards them as a worker. Now, with the issue of the farmer, I think a similar misinterpretation arises where they're trying to call the farmers petty bourgeois. But if you keep in mind that the primary contradiction today is monopoly capital, small forms of capital, when they're facing a struggle against monopoly capital, are progressive. They are objectively progressive. If we look at the history of China and the Chinese Revolution and the period of new democracy, read Mao, right? Mao went as far as to say, look, the bourgeoisie, not just the petty bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie, if it doesn't ally with imperialism, although we might have to keep a suspicious eye on them, but if it doesn't ally with imperialism, they're objectively a revolutionary class. So we have to understand that the Marxist method, dialectical materialism, means that we have to analyze each situation concretely, and we can't copy and paste conclusions from one epoch or from one place onto another epoch or another place. To analyze each thing anew in its context and its unique interconnections and its unique process and its unique history. And farmers, even if they constitute a petty bourgeoisie, if they're fighting against monopoly capital, it is objectively a progressive force.
Very powerful. Go ahead, Brother Fox.
I've just got to read this little paragraph. I think it's out of Dialectical and Historical Materialism by J.V. Stalin. And this is a really good one to reminder that this flows on what Carlos and myself and you've been speaking. And us, it goes, the fall of the utopians, including the Naragniks, anarchists and socialist revolutionaries, was due, among other things, to the fact that they did not recognise the primary role which the conditions of material life of society play in the development of society, and sinking to idealism, did not base their practical activities on the needs of the development of the material life of society, but independently of and in spite of these needs, on ideal plans and all-embracing projects divorced from the real life of society. Well, let's sum that up in that little paragraph, what we've just been talking about, and those that are not supporting the farmers. I think it's vital just to keep that in mind as well. I'll write it in the comments section while we're talking.
Thank you, brother. And that right there, what he just read, is like the complete and whole problem with all these folks going around trying to call themselves Marxists because it's cool now. It won't cool in the South when I was trying to do it, even into college, and now it's cool and everybody want to be identifying with it. but they're not getting to the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter is, it ain't about you being cooler than everybody and you being like you're the good white person, or you're the good American, or you're so much morally superior and you're so intellectual, because you read a little bit of Marx or read this and that, or all the countries that identified as cap or communist and have a gun and say they're Maoist or what have you, are the coolest and the best in the world. And when it comes down to reality to it, it's about advancing the material conditions of the people, historical progress, where humanity as a whole is put in better conditions and then can advance higher forms of society. And this happens through class struggle. And it happens through class struggle. And one aspect of class struggle is national struggle against imperialism. And I think it's a wonderful and beautiful thing. And this is why, everybody was so hard. They was all broke up about the Soviet Union falling, but then they just straight up wrote off Ba'athist Arab socialism in Syria. They wrote off the Iranian Revolution. They like to criticize the Bolivarian socialist revolutions and social models. They like to write off China. They like to write off Vietnam. When this is class struggle, and this is history moving forward, and just as it don't fit in with your perfect image of the identity of socialism that you want to go with, it's still class struggle, and it's still human beings having better lives and struggling for those better conditions. Comrade Carlos Garrido, any response on those kind of thoughts?
I agree. As you folks know, I am a philosopher, and I've been developing a sort of theoretical criticism for the phenomena you describe as a purity fetish. That's what they have. It's a purity fetish. They have this pure idea of socialism that's fetishized, so disconnected completely from reality. And then they judge the movements towards socialism and anti-imperialist projects according to that pure idea. And if it doesn't check off every single box on their checklist, they reject it and they condemn it for X, Y, and Z, or for whatever box it fails to check off. And we have to understand that there's a linkage between these interpretive failures geopolitically and the failure to organize segments of the working class at home, which don't check off some of the boxes that they have for certain positions on social issues. And this approach to politics is ultimately futile, because the job of Marxists and Marxist-Leninist communists, as Mao, once said, is to brainwash. Right. Part of what we're doing is brainwashing and bringing people to a specific position, to class consciousness, so that they can act as a revolutionary agent. Which means that understands that there's already certain elements of backwardness that are floating around, because we are in a decrepit capitalist culture that people are developing in. And if you expect the proletariat, the working class, the masses to have the perfect ideas before you can organize them, you're putting yourself in a position for eternal failure, right? I've used the image of the myth of Sisyphus, which is this old Greek story of Sisyphus trying to push up the rock, and as soon as he gets to the top, the rock falls, and it's a perpetual cycle of doing that. That seems to be the condition of the left in the U.S., right? And it's continually promoting this perspective that, if there's workers that don't agree on absolutely everything with me, I'm not going to go there and organize, because they can't change their mind. They're going to stay like that forever. And it's ultimately an anti-dialectical point of view. And the core of our materialism is that it's a dialectical materialism. We look at things in their interconnections and their processes. And a lot of what passes as Marxism nowadays doesn't have that. It's both idealist and non-dialectical.
Thank you, comrade. We're coming up on our half an hour news section. I won't going to throw this in there, but I think I will. This is a little bit of a controversial issue, and it goes along with what we're saying. Recently, the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, and this is a horrible day for women who, no longer have reproductive health, no longer make choices with their own bodies, and because the horrible declining capitalist economy, This requires, child care as well, and labor on top of that, and the necessary societal function. But the same, and a lot of people are rightfully going out into the streets within this movement, and there's ways to get into people. But there's something I got to say about this. Back in 2012 in North Carolina, the conservatives, the Republicans, brought up an amendment to the state constitution called Amendment 1, and it effectively outlawed gay marriage. It was one woman, one man um, um, bill. It was a very regressive law, but this is the Bible Belt in North Carolina, and one of the only places that is a community space where you're not being directly engaged in capitalist activity, while you're not expected to buy things or you're not expected to work for the capitalists, are the religious institutions. And there are working class people, black and brown people, who have different social views than, those more liberally minded, urban folks, or those who are involved in organizing in politics. And what happened was they were able to get poor black and brown people to vote Republican using this social issue. And I'm looking at this now with the abortion, and what is the main issue that the majority of the working class is concerned about? The major issue facing the majority of the working class people right now is inflation. It is the worsening of the economy. It is the gas prices. But who's talking about the gas prices? Who's talking about inflation? It's the opposition party, because the Democrats are in power, and the Democrats have not done anything to help us on the economy. They have not done anything to do with COVID. They've drugged their feet. They have made it worse. They have declared war against Russia with these sanctions. They've been doing a whole bunch of horrible stuff to attack the working people. So they're going to bring up a social issue, and they're going to escalate a social issue. So, and on a social issue, they ain't done nothing to do to help the people. Roe v. Wade, they knew could have been overturned for a minute now, and they had majorities under Obama. They had majorities now under Biden. And this is something that goes all the way back to the civil rights movement. You can look at speeches where Malcolm X goes, oh, you're going to vote for a party that has 2/3 of the government, and they don't bring your issue up till last. This was talk about the civil rights legislation that didn't get passed when the Democrats were in power, and people continued to identify with that party. And there's something to be said about that. And I think what we need to do is not let, the Democratic Party and the corporate news tell us what the main issues are, but actually make connections within your community. Find out what the most pressing issues are in your community and build independent power in the community. And I don't think abortion is the primary issue at this point. It's an important issue, but I think it's being used as a divisive tactic as the Democrats. Go ahead, Comrade Fox.
Well, what I'm saying, what's happening over the US there, the Democrats are just using this as an election platform. That's all they're doing. They're not going to change it. They had, and like you correctly point out, they had every opportunity under Obama to rectify the situation, including now. I mean, Biden was there the other day on the news and basically saying, yes, you need to make sure we vote Democrat for the midterm elections, basically. And same thing that AOC and all the rest of them are putting out there. Why can't they do something about it right now? Right, and and I think Caleb Maupin hit the nail right on the head. The reason why that Roe versus Wade case was knocked on the head is because basically the forces they're anti-abortion and that were well organised. They've been fighting this for years, and they forced it into a situation where they managed to have a decision ruled in their favour. And basically, what everyone should learn from this. You need to be organised. It's basically an old principle. We need to be organised and be able to. We have to fight for what we want to gain. We can't. It's not given to us. All the promises a politician makes up there. We'll promise you the world, and then we should all very well know it's the system itself that even if the politician means well and goes into our equivalent here is a parliament, but the Congress in the US, they're not. It will. What? And the fact is, they're not going to give it to you. It has to be fought for. Then, really, the agitation's got to be done outside of the Congress, the parliaments, whatever we want to call them. That's where the real fight's got to be, and that's a lesson which will be learned. And I think, look, those people have been campaigning around that important issue. I mean, look, it is for them. It's probably important, but I think if you're going to campaign, you're going to have to realise don't put all your eggs in one basket, and don't just hitch it on the Democratic bandwagon, because I can guarantee you're going to be let down very badly if they happen to control both houses after the midterm elections. And so, what are you going to do? And I think the question is for that: if your demands are not met, what are you going to do about it?
See, Comrades Carlos Garrido, I know this is a touchy subject. Your thoughts on the issue?
I think with respect to the futility of the Democrats, you both hit the nail on the head. They're going to use this to toy around with people to get more donations. They've already gotten, I think, the last thing I saw was like 80 billion, I think, out of it. So they're definitely going to toy with it for political reasons. And like you said, Dust, they could have done it under Obama. They could have done it under Biden. They knew it was coming, but they don't do it, right? I would say that I think that I wouldn't classify the issue of abortion as either wholly social or wholly a class issue. It's a mixture of both, in my opinion, because Engels says in the origins of the family comes to be in history, the struggle against patriarchy and the struggle of women when they come into the monogamous family. And all class societies have oppressed women, and capitalism specifically. It makes the monogamous family an economic unit, and the role that reproductive labor plays in capital in general is very, very big. And what we find in the U.S. is that we don't have any of the conditions to raise a family. None of them. We don't have childcare. We don't have parental leave programs. We don't have anything. It's like very difficult to raise a family because it's very difficult to get a house. It's very difficult to get a good job that allows you to survive. So we have horrible conditions, and most people recognize that these aren't ideal times to have a child. And abortion offers poor and working class people an option to not put themselves in an even bigger hole. A child is a blessing, but in its right time. So the capitalists can't have this, and I think that this attack on abortion rights is a class issue in that sense, because what women produce, the human beings that they produce, ultimately end up being thrown into really just agents for the creation of surplus value for capital, for the creation of profit. But it's also a social issue in the sense that there's religion plays a big role, and how you interpret what goes on during abortion plays a really big role. So it's a both and I think the big I'm all in favor of people hitting the streets for this. I think we should hit the streets for this, and always bring up the property question. If we know that the root of the problem is not just policies, it's not just a specific party or another. The root of the problem is the capitalist imperialist system. We should always bring that up, and when we see people in motion, we should go there and bring up the property question. But I don't think that it's helpful when we make the target and then start characterizing with all these evil predicates working class people that for religious reasons they don't agree with abortion, because the reality is most of them are not like militating in favor of the abortion ban, right? Most working class people are not the ones in front of Planned Parenthood 24/7, in order to class comfort that allows you to spend time just protesting in front of fucking Planned Parenthood. So working class people that have, what I consider personally some backwardness tied to their religious views, they're not the problem. Stop hating on them. I think that's a big mistake. Realize that the problem is the monopoly capitalists, and in that way you can get people who disagree with your point on abortion on board, because they realize that 99% of the things that they are concerned about in their everyday life come from the same source that took away the abortion rights from the people that are in the streets right now.
Very powerful, very powerful. Yeah, I think that's the big takeaway from this. I'm not criticizing folks out there. All I'm saying is, don't let them use this for you to attack fellow workers. Your, coworker or neighbor who is pro-life is not your enemy. Maybe they would be out in the streets to fight for higher wages. A big proletarian feminist demand that I think the Workers' Party and the United Kingdom gets right is 24/7 childcare available to the people as a working class demand. And I think that's something that a lot of people can fight for. And I notice a lot of liberals like to attack, people who voted Trump. And a lot of people that voted Trump, there was a lot of racism in it, but it was also a lot of protest to the neoliberal policies. And believe it or not, Trump's daughter was out there giving out hollow promises of free childcare. A lot of these people like to say, oh, all white people is racist. Look at all the women that voted for Trump. What you don't look at during the Trump campaign, Trump's daughter was out there saying, oh, if Trump becomes president, he's going to give free childcare to people. And I think that's really a lot of the reason. It won't just the racism. There was a lot of economic demands and false promises that, Trump was appealing to. And, not all Trump voters are our enemy. Not all pro-life people are our enemy. Fellow workers are trying to do the same thing you trying to do, trying to live, trying to improve their conditions. And if you honestly get a conversation, make connections with people, you'd be rather surprised. People are willing to fight for you. People are willing to get beside you. And there's tons and tons of quality, stories through the 30s and 50s where, former racist people holding formerly backwards views coming around and joining the class struggle. And, it's no different in China. China was a semi-feudal society where women had their feet bound so they couldn't walk. So they could, be good little wives and stuff, but, or they couldn't leave so they weren't getting pregnant because they was, property or what have you in the way it was set up. And, Mao was able to organize those people with those backwards positions to fight against Japanese imperialism and fight against the capitalists. And now they are the leading socialist country today and are lifting other countries out of poverty. So we're going to get into our interview. Like I said, I organize these meetings very similar to the training I received going back to the Communist Party. And one of the traditions was one meeting would be a work meeting. The next meeting would be a study meeting. And during the work meeting, we talk about, the class struggle itself, what we're doing in the union, what we're doing in the community. And then in the study, we study up on that, and that would help inform the work. So what we do for our work meetings in this format is we have a guest on, and we essentially have a work report from them reporting back on their work. So their work can inform our study and vice versa. And this information can go into the collective, and people can use this to analyze their own situations. So we got Carlos Garrido on of Midwestern Marks for the first time. And when we have people on for the first time, we'd like to hear a little bit of their political backstory, as well as a story of what work they have done so far. Comrade Garrido, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your political journey.
Thank you, Comrade Dest. I'm a Cuban American. I was born in Cuba, and I spent most of my life in South Florida around Gusanos, and I had an event. The philosopher Alain Badiou, he has this theory of the events where things happen and then the everydayness of your life just shatters, and like you can't go back to how it was before. The event after my mom had my little sister, she had fibromas, something inside of her that was growing, and they told her that if she doesn't operate it, she might die because it was growing. And I never understood why she couldn't just operate it. We came from a fairly well-off working class family. And all the people that I was surrounded with, that they all hated Cuba, telling her, just go to Cuba, get the operation in Cuba. And I was like, what? Aren't we like the wealthiest nation on the planet? Isn't Cuba bad according to you? Aren't they horrible? Why would you just tell my mom to go to Cuba to have her operation? But anyways, in 2016, and you're probably not going to like this one, does, but in 2016, Bernie has his campaign. He starts having at least his social democratic critiques of capitalism, his critiques of private insurance, and he pulled me started to be able to understand things a bit more systematically, not just blame the condition that we were in for the results. Around that time, I start going into school for philosophy, and I'm reading Marx, I'm reading Lenin. I had a group that were with me that pushed me into organizing locally, into reading theory, and I've kept that going for a while. Yeah, is that good for the background, or do you want a little more?
Um, that's interesting. That's interesting. Maybe I could just comment on that. Yeah, I mean, like I personally think Bernie Sanders did a lot of bad for the understanding of socialism altogether, because people, because of the worsening economy, a lot of people were starting to get into socialism on their own, and then this huge figure comes out and and he essentially says, "Oh, I'm a socialist, and you should vote for the Democratic Party." Imperialist sheepdog. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of folks like yourself who, who are already coming to socialism, and they didn't fall into that trap. And that actually helped them on their journey. Now, would have you happened on that journey anyways, even regardless of Bernie Sanders? Probably, probably, but that's the experience you had. And I think that's a wonderful thing. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about, we meet a lot of folks who are still under the illusions of Bernie Sanders, the imperialist sheepdogs, and the Democratic Party. And when we, as Marxist Leninists, attack figures like Bernie Sanders, attack AOC for right reasons, like I just said, they go along with these wars. They back the most disgusting war criminals. How did you transition? What was your process from going to someone who, was somewhat awakened by Bernie Sanders to joining, the more anti-imperialist camp?
Well, I think it's quite simple, and it's a process that I used when we were knocking doors with Bernie and talking to Trump voters who already had a critique of the media, superficial though it might have been. They were critical of CNN and MSNBC, and I told them, look, just extend that to also Fox News and to these other news stations. Be critical of all the media that you're seeing. And it applies the same way to history. So I saw in the process of organizing how they just straight up lied about Bernie. The Democratic Party, MSNBC, the Democratic establishment, and their pundits, they just lied. And I was like, well, if they're doing this to Bernie, which honestly doesn't really seem that dangerous at all, I wonder what they're doing to other socialist countries. And so I was able to extend that analogy, that analysis. I mean, I also come from a background of my grandfather was a militant in Cuba. He was active in the process of the construction of socialism, so that helped too. But I think Bernie's ambiguous. Of course, I agree with you that he's an imperialist sheepdog, as Mao would say, when it comes to these issues, as well as all the other progressives in the Democratic Party, or progressives, right? But I don't know if there was institutions the size of what Bernie was able to create in that short amount of time that would have helped me lead me to Marxism, Leninism, right? We have this understanding from the Hegelian and the Marxist and the dialectical tradition in general that sometimes mistakes are necessary, right? Mistakes are essential moments to positions that are not mistaken. And I read my Bernie phase as one of those necessary mistaken moments that was a fundamental intermediary step for me to get to Marxism, Leninism. And I know for a lot of folks in my generation, that was the case. That was the case. I don't know what it is for folks in other generations, because I wasn't old enough when Occupy to get involved, right? So maybe the generation that was able to participate in that, and they already had some idea of socialism that was then diluted by Bernie. But for my generation, there was nothing. There was absolutely nothing. Bernie was the first thing most of us came to see. And at least for me, although I criticized the Democrats and his line of the Democrats, as much as anyone else, I still think of him as one of those necessary mistakes in my development towards Marxism-Leninism. I know Eddie shares the same view, and most of the crew that I really developed with, who had the same transition, they share the same views as me there.
Thank you, Comrade. Very insightful. Let's see, Comrade Fox, anything to ask the brother on his background before we move on to his work?
I think you pretty much covered. I was going to start asking about Midwestern Marx, but I think I'll let you continue there.
All right, Comrade Carlos. So let's talk about your work in this period. How did you do any activism other than the Bernie movement before Midwestern Marx?
Yes, I was in DSA for 4 years. In undergrad, Dubuque, Iowa. It's a beautiful, biggest employer. They employed 1,500 workers, and the DSA meetings that we would go to every Sunday, they were at the UAW Union Hall. So I understand that DSA is horrible, but the times it depends on the chapter that you're in, because there's some chapters that are really good. And I had a good experience there. There was a lot of Marxist-Leninists, those people that were just Bernie-crats. But there was a lot of Marxist-Leninists, and we were active organizing our community in ways that helped shape the way that I think about organizing and about mobilizing people and about talking to people about politics. It's very difficult to talk to people about politics. It's usually something, especially in the US, that most people don't want to talk about. So just having the ability to muster up the courage to knock on someone's door and talk to them, whether it's during the Bernie campaign or to sign a petition for X, Y, or Z, it takes a lot. And that was a very formative experience for me, and the sort of somewhat personal confidence that I have in doing the everyday activities that we do with Midwestern Marx, or that Eddie has. That was all developed thanks to the 4 years that we spent just talking to people, knocking on doors, and talking about uncomfortable subjects. But when there was an event that took place in 2019, a socialism conference in Chicago, and it was quite disappointing because the conference, at that time, I was already in favor of really existing socialism. And in that conference, you had guest speakers condemning Nicaragua, condemning Cuba, condemning Venezuela, condemning China. And I was like, what the fuck is this? What is this? How are you going to call yourself a socialist or a Marxist, but reject everywhere where it's been tried? That's just pretty absurd, right? Hey, look, I am this, but everywhere this has been tried, it has failed. But wait, it's we in the West, the virtuous ones, we're the ones that are going to get it right. I thought that was absolutely absurd. And a week after the event, the Gray Zone, Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton published an article about how those speakers had been funded by big capitalists and State Department interests. And it made sense. But the reality was that it wasn't just the speakers, right? It was the people I was looking around that were nodding their heads like, yeah. So I knew that, that DSA was futile at that point, and that if that was the hegemonic left in the US, that something needed to be done to center anti-imperialism. So we start up Midwestern Marx when Eddie and
I just wanted to reply to some of that discussion. I think that article, really, I've been doing, like, I was in Occupy and I was doing all that, and I've had this, like, straight up, because I was part of something and taught, anti-imperialism. I see people claiming to be in my name, but then going up with the State Department. And when Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton came out with that article, that was a serious moment of vindication, that I could easily share that article everywhere to all these people that have been saying all this crap to me. And then they start demonizing Ben Norton and Max Blumenthal and saying they're Putin lovers and all this crazy shit. But I think that the moral of the story we can get into this is that, the people are going to, I think, always, have faith in the people. The people are going to go through what they're going to go through and do the necessary levels of understanding based on the social and political conditions that exist. and it was great to hear stories like that. I think what it puts on us is, us, those of us who are, anti-imperialists, we really need to build our networks. We really need to get our foot game on the ball. We need more shows like this. We need more programs like Midwestern Marks. And I think, and then we can really start to combat this stuff and push people forward. David Fox, and then we can hear more about Midwestern Marks. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, actually, this plays into that about the creation of Midwestern Marks, because I think we've all got there's a lot of interesting similar patterns how people come to Marxism and Leninism, that journey to it, and come to realise it. And obviously, there's some parts I can relate to that as well. So it really comes to show you that there is a quantitative to qualitative changes happening. Even it's like on the individual that come to realise it's the system itself that needs to go. And that's obviously now continues on the formation of Midwestern Marks. It would be quite fascinating how you guys got that together.
Go ahead.
I apologize if there's connection issues. I know how my Wi-Fi is. I'm soon to get this little thing that helps the room that I'm in get better Wi-Fi, but that's pending. That anti-imperialism thing is at the center of why we started Midwestern Marks. But there's two other central topics as well, which is that look, in the Marxist-Leninist tradition, we recognize that just through spontaneity alone and without theory, without the role of a revolutionary vanguard that brings the ideology, that brings the theory to the masses, the highest form of organization you can get is trade unionism, right? We should read the What Is to Be Done and some of the other articles that Lenin writes at this time, that he's arguing against economism, and this is precisely the point that he's arguing against. So I saw that in the US, you have on one side the working class, and on the other side, the supposed intellectuals that are the ones that know the theory. And I realized that insofar as this gulf continues, you're not going to be able to organize a revolutionary movement, right? Because the masses need the revolutionary ideas, and the people supposedly with the revolutionary ideas are disseminating them in ways that are alienating to the working class, or are just in spaces that are not getting intermeshed. So we start Midwestern Marks particularly with that in mind as well, connected to the anti-imperialist dimension of our project. But we think that it's essential to tie the theory that we do, which we try to be as rigorous as we can with our theory. We try to always tie that to practical matters, to organizing, to trying to change the world, right? Our revolutionary theory is not just done for the sake of publishing in journals, for getting book contracts. Our revolutionary theory, and what makes it special, what makes it unique, is that it is grounded in and aimed towards revolutionary praxis, towards changing the world in a revolutionary manner. So that was one of the core tenets of our project that led us to starting the project. And then lastly, we saw that, some of the people that had the theory, we had this one extreme. Now, after a whole lot of Lenin reading, we can call the right opportunists, which are the Bernie flank. And then the other extreme is the ultra left, right, which are going out into the streets, burning American flags, saying that socialism is when you completely destroy America. And the way that I have interpreted it, and Eddie as well, is that what they're doing is taking the gun that McCarthyism was pointing at socialism, the propaganda McCarthyism was using to separate the working class from communists, taking the gun away from McCarthy and pointing it at themselves. That's effectively what they're doing. And it's, again, theoretically, it comes from a mistake that is rooted in a lack of dialectical thinking. So from the start, we also had this tenet that that tries to recapture the positive history of the U.S., the histories of struggles. Wherever there's oppression, wherever there's exploitation, there's struggle. And we look at the U.S. as a project that, like everything else in the world, is contradictory. It contains both the history of genocide, it contains the history of slavery, of imperialism, of exploitation, of capitalism, but it contains within that a rich history of struggle against that ugly history. And that rich history of struggle is not in the, it's barely known by those who claim themselves to be Marxists in the US. Very small portions of it are known, but we don't know that there was people trying to develop scientific socialism in the fucking 1820s, 2 decades before Marx and Engels wrote any work of prominent significance, but we're recapturing this history in our project. And as a philosophy instructor, I teach an intro to philosophy class, and I have my students read Marx, Engels, Lenin, Che, and these revolutionary figures, and a lot of them are really into it. And they ask me, why is it that the U.S. doesn't like socialism? Why is it that American people don't like socialism? And I told them that's very new. In the 19th century, the birth of modern socialism took place in the U.S. We had a ton of utopian communist communities all over the place from which Marx and Engels studied and learned from and developed from mistakes and from their limitations scientific socialism. So this antagonism of here's the US on one side, here's socialism on the other, this is new. This is a fabrication of McCarthyism and of the acceptance of this new ultra-left flank of the left, of those McCarthyite smears. And what we try to conclude with is a statement by Cornel West, which, you know, for all his flaws, that he falls sometimes into the right opportunist camp, he's real right in saying this, which is that socialism is as American as apple pie, right? We've had socialism basically from the beginning of the American project, the struggle against capital, the struggle against imperialism, the struggle against slavery. And that part of our history we try to recapture, because if socialism is going to develop in the US, it's not going to come in a foreign suit. It's not going to come wrapped up in Mao posters and Lenin posters. Look, I love my Mao, I love my Lenin. But the revolutions take place in concrete circumstances with concrete conditions, and they develop according to the specific characteristics and histories of the place in which they are developing in. And so if we're going to have socialism in the US, it's going to be socialism grounded in this tradition of struggle. So it is our objective to go back, trace it out, develop this history for the masses so that we give our struggles today historical legs. And so that when we talk about socialism, it doesn't feel like something new, but we show them, hey, baby, it's always been here. It's always been here. So those are the three central tenets that led us to create Midwestern Marx at a time when we weren't really seeing any of these all together. We were seeing all of these mistakes in different areas. Everyone lacked a little bit of something. We were always open to working with everyone, lacked a little bit of something. And we wanted to do a project that, although inclusive, was very clearly not going to bend in these specific areas. Since then, there's been, of course, new projects that have emerged, and we're very happy to see those. We've collaborated with almost all of them, but that's what led us to start Midwestern Marx.
If I have my hat on, I'll take it off to you, brother. That is absolutely beautiful and inspiring and refreshing to hear, especially from young folks coming up and coming to these necessary conclusions. I mean, I look at my tradition and where I come from. You know, in North Carolina is supposed to be one of the backwards, most backward states in the country, one up from South Carolina. And I look at the history of the fusion parties where freed slaves and populous farmers came together and developed their own government and put the former slave-owning Democrats out of power, and a coup d'etat was happening against them. And I look at the regulators, and I look at the progressive elements of the FDR years, and looking back at the Civil War, not that the monopoly capitalists and Abraham Lincoln was the main force, but the abolitionists and the workers and the farmers and the Quakers, who stood up against the slavery and the Underground Railroad. And it's beautiful and inspiring. I see a lot of these folks saying, America was always evil. There ain't been nothing. They just giving our history over to the fascists, giving our history over to the right wing. And I'm tired and I'm happy. His brother, Georgy Dimitrov says, what I just said, I just paraphrased Georgy Dimitrov, the greatest anti-fascist, that worked under Stalin, that stood up in a fascist kangaroo court and out-argued him. It's some good stuff. But let's talk about this. You guys got a book coming out. Y'all started with this TikToking, and then y'all did this TikTok and had millions of views and what have you. You got 20,000 followers on YouTube. Brother Fox,
Yep.
say a little bit you got to do, and he can get back.
Yeah, and I just for the audience, I've actually put the link to the YouTube channel in the comments section, and if you scroll through the comments section, I also put a link to the webpage as well. And if you don't mind, because I was going to ask you about the new book, because someone asked in the audience here about the new book, and can I just share the screen just so all the viewers can have a look at it? And Carlos, if you wish to speak on it.
Yes, this book is the project, the 2 decades long project of our counseling editor at our project, Thomas Riggins. He's been a philosophy professor for more than 60 years in prestigious institutions such as NYU, City University, New York, the New School for Social Research. But unlike most of the people that are in there that claim themselves to be radical in thinking, Thomas Riggins has been active in the socialist and communist movement since he was basically a teenager. He's been in the Communist Party for most of his life, and he's someone whose theoretical activity is always tied to revolutionary praxis, which, as I mentioned, is one of the core tenets of our project. And what this book tries to do is help people who haven't gotten into Marxism yet, who are looking to read the classics of Marxism, by tracing out in classical texts of Marx, from Marx, from Engels, from Lenin, by tracing out and commenting on what is being said, analyzing it in forms in which any working class person, regardless of how little theory they've engaged with, in forms that they can understand, and by also developing for perhaps the more seasoned reader in the areas where the science has gone beyond what Engels or what Lenin commented on, for instance, in Anti-Düring or in Materialism and Imperial Criticism, since Riggins, as a philosopher, as a Marxist philosopher, knows something which most Western Marxists forget, which is that Marxism and Marxism-Leninism needs to keep up with the sciences. Riggins has always kept up with the sciences. And so he's able to talk here about, although the science has developed, has dialectical materialism been confirmed? Has it not? What's the condition? You know, just to sort of give you a heads up, it has, of course. But that's what we're trying to do in this book. I for a long time, I would have books that I would recommend. Ask me, what's the first book that I should go to? And I'd recommend sometimes Socialism and Utopian and Scientific, Black Shirts and Red. I would throw Black Shirts and Reds at everyone's head in college. Now I'm recommending this one, not just because we published it, but because it contains all the best parts of the books that I used to recommend before. Because imagine it's someone that's been involved in the political struggle, so he's able to connect the ideas to the political battles that took place in the Soviet Union, that took place in China, that have taken place in the US against fascism, against neoliberal capitalism that passes itself as nice because it's somewhat progressive on social issues. So it's a very rich book. It's 430 pages, but it's very readable and enjoyable. And it's the first book inaugurating our publishing press. Part of our project, besides those three central tenets that we try to distinguish ourselves from the rest when we created ourselves, part of what we try to do in our project is cast the net as wide as possible, right? By any means necessary, whether it's a 1-minute TikTok done by Eddie explaining the labor theory of value, or talking about politics and geopolitics and criticizing imperialism, debunking imperialist propaganda, whether it's those 1-minute TikToks, whether it's videos, video interviews, the articles we publish, 50 to 100 articles any given month, or now the press, right? The press is a place where we want to, in a more scholarly and rigorous arena, develop Marxist theory in a way that it's grounded in revolutionary praxis. Do it with affordable means. I mean, you go look up any new Marxist theory book, and you'll find that, for instance, Palgrave, they have a very affordable series compared to the other ones, but their new books from the Marx Engels Marxism series are $60, right? And as a scholar who has to engage with new materials, I don't got that type of money. So that's we're trying to do that affordably. And another central part of our project, which is tied to the view that we have about American history, is the Journal of American Socialist Studies, where we try to, from an interdisciplinary point of view, recapture the radical history of the U.S. and show that there's a history of struggle and that we should build on this in our projects today.
Thank you, brother. Very, very inspiring. Let's see. I think that we're getting pretty close. We've already passed the hour. We got to move on to our workshop. Brother Carlos Garrido, if there's one thing you could communicate to the audience either about what you've learned through your work or something about your work in this recent period, what would it be?
Um, so I think that it's very important to destroy the myths, the big myths, right? One of them was the bridge that is artificially created between America or Americans and socialism. Another big one is that socialism has always failed. And unfortunately, this is a myth that is sustained by most people who claim themselves to be socialists, right? Um, we have to debunk those myths because the reality is, as Michael Parenti has said, that the problem with saying socialism hasn't failed is that it hasn't worked, is that it has worked for millions and millions of people who have been lifted out of poverty and given decent living conditions and dignity, the dignity that humans require, but which capitalism always fails to give. And even another thing that I try to hammer out in my organizing is that the things that American people, that the American working class enjoys the most, wasn't given to them because of capitalism. It wasn't the good heart of the capitalists which offered them, Medicaid or Medicare and some of the Social Security, the programs they enjoy the most, right? The more popular programs in the country. Um, those were results of struggles that were waged by organized labor, led usually by members in the Communist Party, the Socialist Party. Even anarchists were very involved in this process. So these myths are perhaps the most important thing that we can do today, deconstruct them. And that's tied to the anti-imperialist spirit that we always have to keep up, because if we show that socialism worked in other places, unlike what most of the left thinks, that it actually worked, we have a message of hope that we're bringing to the working class. If not, we're just, in the same position that the Bolsheviks were in, right? We're creating something new. The reality is we're creating something new, but it's also not new because it's been tried elsewhere and it's worked. It's worked. So we are in a far more advanced position than the Bolsheviks were when they were carrying out the revolution. We have experiments that have been tried, that have failed in certain specific areas, and learned from those failures in order to overcome the contradictions that developed internally. And we should learn from that and be able to craft a program that goes to the masses and says, look, this is what's going to raise your living standards. This is what's going to make you feel like you have autonomy and an everyday say, both in the government and in your workplace. And that's what socialism is, right? As Fred Hampton said, socialism is the people. If you are afraid of socialism, you're afraid of the people. It's that simple.
Thank you, comrade. Thank you. Quick shout out to the Flame of Liberation. He recently did a video about the assassination of the Japanese politician. We were unable to cover that in our news section, but if you'd like to go over to his channel and view that, you can learn more about that issue there. Let's see. So maybe I'll just kind of like sum it up for folks, man. It's really glad. I think we're vibing on a lot of issues. You got from the Haymarket riots to the experimental and utopian socialists of the early 1800s to, the second American Revolution and the Civil War, and then the Panthers and the United the the original Rainbow Coalition, to labor unions, to the people that I'm coming that I'm coming out of the tradition of the South, that integrated the first interracial unions here. There's so much to learn from and build on and look back upon, and we ain't gonna get it. We ain't gonna get nowhere beating over the heads and getting people full of pessimism and despair. It's gonna come from hope, out of the positive elements of the history and the positive elements that exist within the people. And that's absolutely beautiful. And as far as, the logo for this show is a truck and a book. And it's basically work and study. And that means two things: activism and class struggle, as well as we are the working class. And we're going through the class struggle on the one day. And we ain't going to put it all up to them academics and then bourgeois institutions. We can understand socialism and Marxist Leninist science better than they can because of our experience. And then we can come together and have that knowledge as a collective and understand even better and push this struggle forward. Let's see, Comrade Fox, anything or response to the brother story before we move on to the workshop?
Well, I think this is a great initiative, and I'm glad how you pointed out it's new, but it's not new either. And really, what it comes down to, this is what needs to be done, if you want to use that term. And I think what we're doing here needs to be done. It's just this is all part of organising as well. It's not getting into silly squabbles or winding ourselves up dead ends all the time. This is the actual part of the practical work, not the complete practical work, but part of it and the education that goes along with it. And what's good about this, having a talk to yourself, about even with myself and Dust, we're all learning from each other. We're gaining more knowledge as moving along. And I hope the audience it's the same. And that we are serious about this. We need to change society from a capitalist imperialist one to a socialist one, because basically, if we're going to go up and dead end cul-de-sacs all the time, well, I've got grave concerns for the humanity and the rest of the planet. So that's it's some serious work that needs to be done. And obviously, look, there is. It's good to see two comrades out there are trying to make it much more accessible and easier to understand as well. What I've always said, don't go running off. Just read Marx's Capital, Volume 1. I mean, start with the simple stuff that's easy to absorb first, and then build yourself up into further reading. Thank you.
Every time Marx's Capital is mentioned, I got to make a plug on here. On this channel, we have archived a study from a Chicano nationalist revolutionary perspective, a year-long study on Marx's Capital, over 40 hours of it, between the poet and professor. If folks want to check that out, it's good
fantastic
stuff. So we're going to get right into our workshop. We're getting near the end of the show, maybe another 15 minutes or so. And what we do here is we can talk all we want, but if we don't get out there and start talking with the people, then we ain't nothing. If we can't mobilize the people, we just a bunch of hot airbags. So we got to know how to talk to the people. And if we're going to do, and we also need to point out some of the alienating and backward stuff in our movement and be able to criticize that. And I think we're going to take this time to kind of poke out some of the more negative positions that people are putting out there that have been creating rifts in our movement altogether. And so right now I'm going to pretend to be somebody who I think is taking an unnecessary, divisive, and unprincipled and undeveloped position. I'm going to try to speak like I'm a little younger. I'm a little bit prettier, but nah, basically.
Oh, Dust, you're always beautiful, mate.
Basically, I'm going to put out there. I've been hearing this around. The recent election in Colombia is nothing but a green branded imperialist social sheepdog, and that doesn't mean anything. And if you're not a real communist, if you support or are cheering on the recent election victory in Colombia. Now, if I was to say that, you heard somebody saying that, how would you respond to that, Comrade David Fox?
Well, I'd have to, first of all, let's put the point in hand. There's quantitative to a qualitative change, right? And obviously, Colombia has been virtually a semi-feudal fascist state for a very, very long time, where you've got few families control, I think, over 88% of the land there. Poverty is very extreme crime, obviously with the drug trafficking. It's basically a terrorist state on its own population against unions, workers and unions, peasants, farmers, and other generally poor folk, and also indigenous as well. So this, look, we all know. Oh, okay. Look, I know that the new president of Colombia is not a card-carrying communist. I mean, no shit, Sherlock. But I mean, really, I didn't know that. Basically, this is still an historical moment. Now, we can't predict how things are going to be moving on, because the sinister forces that are still controlling Colombia are still there, and they're going to be trying to organise everything possible to fight back, even possibly assassinate him as well. So they've obviously, look, the Colombian people are going to have to determine their own struggle. We shouldn't be like telling them how to struggle and fight. They've been doing it for a very long time anyway. So I think it's very wrong for us to actually go in and tell them how they should struggle. It is historic, but it's a quantitative change. I also believe socialism is not in Colombia yet. That's for a long period of intense struggle. As Lenin correctly said, the struggle is a long and tedious one. And obviously, but this has helped them to give them maybe some breathing space, some time to actually organise their forces stronger to move society on and change their society. So I'm not going to look. I'm over here in Australia, so look, I'm aware of it. And I thought when I looked at that, I said that's a positive step forward in the right direction. How it pans out, well, who knows? But it's going to be the masses that are going to determine the outcome, not the one person.
Comrade Carlos, how would you respond to such a statement?
I agree with Comrade David. If you remember the old Rocky boxing movies, although the boxing is itself not very realistic, at some point after taking so many punches, you would have been knocked out. But one of the things that helps Rocky is landing that first punch. Once he lands the first punch number 2, number 3 comes around, and what has happened in Colombia is that they have landed their first punch. The masses have organized themselves, they have mobilized, and they have won a victory. Now, the victory is not socialism, as David, you were saying. The victory is not this great turn towards communism, but it's a victory in a country that has had 240 years of governments where it's just capital. There's no even semblance of a pro-labor government. So this is a historic victory. It was a victory that was achieved by the masses, right? By the more popular elements in a country where it's a disaster. 44 people. We talked a couple weeks ago to Comrade Libre and Yamir, who were both part of the election process in Colombia from Troika Collective. 44 people have died just in this last election while trying to participate in the electoral campaign of Petro. This is the condition that Colombia is in. As Comrade Libre said in the interview with us, it's the most difficult place in the world to exercise democratic voting rights. And now they have won. The fact that they are even alive is just a massive victory. Of course, Pedro has his past. He said things on Twitter that we, wouldn't agree with as people who are very not just respectful, but defendant of Venezuela, of Russia because of its anti-imperialist role, of Cuba. But we have to understand that he understood that there had to be compromises made to win, because what the right was going to the whole time was, you're just going to make this like Venezuela. You're just going to this. You're just going to that, right? But I think it's definitely a step forward to the left. It's not going towards socialism, but it's a step towards progressive politics. It's the first punch that the masses have landed, and it creates the conditions for them to realize, hey, if we do this and we win, if we organize and mobilize, we can win. And if the people who won didn't do enough, we can continue fighting, right? So that's where I stand. I understand the people that are skeptical because of what some of the things that Gustavo has said. I understand that, but they have to look at it in a larger context and realize that it is a historically progressive move in Colombia.
Comrade Fox, very quickly, and I'll go ahead.
Yeah, and just add on what we mean. Everything there are all these quantitative changes or stages to a qualitative one. Things just don't suddenly happen. Socialism just didn't suddenly happen, and because that's very idealistic to think it does. It depends on the concrete material conditions at the time and where the masses are at. So, and the masses down there have to operate under those material conditions. That's what they've got to operate under. So, obviously, let's watch this space and see how things move forward. And look, we should be actually expressing solidarity to the masses of Colombia. They're trying to make change down there.
This is my advice to the young comrade. Go ahead, Carlos, and then I'll end it.
Just real quick, because I mentioned his comments on Venezuela. He's already stated quite a few times that he's willing to reestablish connections with Venezuela. So I think that supports the thesis that some of his negative comments on it are a compromise. Because if you consider Venezuela to be a dictator, like he said at one point, compared it to Bolsonaro and to Trump, you don't negotiate with them, right? And he's negotiating with them now. So I think that the people that have been the closest to it, that I've talked to, Comrade Ymir, Comrade Libre, they're very hopeful about this. And as someone who's watching it from the US, who hasn't traveled to Colombia, who hasn't seen directly the activities of the masses, who am I to tell them, no, this is actually not something progressive. He's really just an imperialist sheepdog. No, it's if they tell me, who have been there, who think like me, who are Marxist Leninists, who have followed this process closely, that it is definitely something to be hopeful about. I sure as shit am going to listen to them and not contradict them online or in the platforms that I have.
I think my advice to the young folks is these Twitter beefs, and even me doing this now, this is out of sincere respect and constructive criticism for folks to develop further. I ain't attacking nobody. I'm lifting everybody up and trying to push them in a better direction. And my advice is, if you're up on the line and your main strategy is to attack what you consider the synthetic left or the rad libs, if that's your main focus, is to fight with them and to get more Twitter likes and to get more views, you ain't keeping your eyes on the prize, is to say. And what we're trying to do is really understand the things on a material level, on a global level, and then use that understanding to organize our families, our communities, and push history forward. And I think if I got to look at this in context, a lot of the victories in Latin America and throughout the world have been partially because of the declining power of U.S. imperialism. And it's specifically in this current era where Russia has stood up against the imperialists in Ukraine and denazified and disarmed, and the United States came up with all these crazy sanctions, disrupted the global economy, and then the ruble bounced right back. And then more, the Chinese and the Russians came together and started making former alliances. I always put this a war of attrition. It's kind of like that whack-a-mole game. And, the imperialists, they got a big old hammer. But all the moles stand up at once, they ain't gonna bop them all in the heads. And that hammer just got a little bit smaller. So a lot of these folks can be able to stand up and do something about it. If this politician would have ran even a decade ago, he would have been straight up killed by the imperialists, but he ain't now because of the changing conditions. And it ain't just the changing conditions. If we look at the recent strikes in the poorest places within Colombia, specifically in the indigenous regions and the Afro-Colombian regions, people have been in horrible conditions, have been rising up and fighting and dying to get more say and to have more power in their community. And when you get up there and say, you know better, and to say, oh, that's trash because it don't live up to my ideal, because I got a Twitter beef with these people and I want to look better than them, you are insulting oppressed people that are fighting for their lives on the front line of the global struggle. You need to cut that shit out. That's what I got to say about it. Let's see. Let's see. Going on to the next issue. We're going to, is it okay if we run, actually, I think we're going to end it there. I had another one available, but I think we're going to go into a round of concluding statements. Let's see. We'll start with Brother Fox, and then I'll go, and then we'll have Comrade Garrido have the last word. Concluding statements, Comrade Fox.
Yeah, look, I think there's been a fantastic discussion tonight, and it's good to see you doing the great work out there, Carlos, the work that needs to be done, and many other comrades involved in that. And look, I'm going to have a look at your YouTube channel later on. I'll go onto the website, look at the order of that book. I've got a hell of a library myself at the moment, so I know there's books there I haven't read as yet, and at the time. I think overall, it's been a good discussion tonight. And I think we're focusing on what's primary and not what more, which is really essentially important. We've got to keep our eye on the 8 ball, as we use that terminology here, but not get distracted so much there's other issues out there certainly, and they are important. And they're important to those people they affect. But we always got to raise the property question back then, the class issue, back to it, and the system itself. And I think if we're going to keep focused on that, otherwise we're just going to go up into what I call the dead end of a philosophical cul-de-sac.
Right on. So I am absolutely honored to finally meet the ideological powerhouse behind Midwestern Marks, Brother Carlos Garrido. He said a lot of inspiring things, and he's actually helping me develop, hearing that his understanding of, we don't know everything. I might sound like a loudmouth trucker, but I'm sitting here, I'm trying to listen, I'm trying to learn from these folks, and hearing that stuff about how, getting involved with Bernie Sanders and DSA led him to his strong anti-imperialist position. Now, we can all learn from each other. And I think that's really what it is at the end of the day. We ain't trying to promote our ego. We ain't trying to boost our brand. We trying to learn from each other the best we can to understand history, to mobilize our people and push history forward and improve the conditions of our communities. And if we want to improve the conditions of our communities, we got to learn how to talk to the people. We got to learn how to build up the people. We got to learn how to serve the people. We can't just be like, oh, I know this and I know that, and you better know it or I don't want to talk to you. You got to go out, see where the people is at, understand, be a part of the community, make those connections and speak to people where they're at and build on the positive sentiments they currently hold. Let's see, Brother Carlos Garrido, we're going to let you have the last final word. What would you like to leave the viewers with tonight?
Well, first, thanks again for having me on. It's been a very insightful conversation. I've really enjoyed talking to you too. We can't say specifically what factors all need to be there, what particularities need to be there for a revolution to take place. But we can estimate from looking at the past what certain elements have been there before in order for a qualitative change in society to occur. And we know that one of these is objective conditions, which means that capitalism needs to be in crisis in order for people to mobilize. It creates conditions for people to mobilize. Another one is subjective conditions, right? Which means people understanding that the issues that they face on an everyday basis are not tied to specific politicians. They're not tied to a specific party in power. They're not tied to a specific policy. They're tied to the existing order, to the system, to how it is that we produce, to the state institutions that come about in order to protect how we produce, and to the civil institutions that come about in order to help you think in ways that make you acquiescence and fall in line with the way we produce. So that subjective element, that's class consciousness. That is our task. We have had crisis after crisis after crisis, and the American people are suffering. As I've repeated quite a few times, I always repeat it, half of the American working class is a lost paycheck away from homelessness. A lost paycheck away from joining the 600,000 homeless people in a country that has 10 times as many homes as homeless people. This is absurd. We have inflation going on. Our politicians are trying to scapegoat and blame Russia, when in reality, it's the capitalists that jack up the prices. We have a undemocratic Supreme Court taking away rights from women in order to benefit the capitalist imperialist order. We have the objective conditions as ripe for revolution as we'll ever have them. We have an empire in decay, a multipolar world that is flourishing and coming about. What we have to do is get to the masses. We have to get to the masses. We have to talk to our coworkers. We have to talk to the people in our communities, tie the issues that they feel direly on an everyday basis to the existing order, and organize them in a revolutionary manner. That's the only thing that can create a future for humanity that brings hope and not destruction. We do have a very real threat and a very real fight against the clock with climate change. And that's something that only socialism can fix. Only socialism can have a sustainable form of development because it thinks of growth in terms of human terms and not in terms of capital. It shifts the center from capital to humans. And that's the only thing we can do to have a sustainable future. And so quite literally, it's socialism or barbarism as more than it's ever been before. So it is our duty not to bicker with one another about unessential things, but to unite to get to the masses, to organize them in a revolutionary manner, and to overthrow the existing order. It's that simple.
All right, that's going to end it for tonight. If everybody could raise their fist and repeat after me, dare to struggle,
Dare to struggle.
Dare to struggle.
dare to win,
Dare to win.
all power to the people.
All power to the people.
Right on. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night, comrades.
All the best.